All right, can you hear me okay? Sorry about that. I feel a bit embarrassed because we sit within the privacy and technology transactions team at Polsinelli and clearly can't actually get the slides to work. I'm Liz Harding. I'm a partner just around the corner at Polsinelli, and my good friend and colleague Romain.
So I'm Romain Marshall. I've come over from Salt Lake City, and I'm also a shareholder with Liz at Polsinelli. Can I say a bit more about that? So Liz and I go way back. We're 20-year lawyers, 20-plus-year lawyers, and we've worked at a firm here in town called Holland & Hart. It's a really good Denver-grown law firm that's 50-plus years old. And then we went separate ways to other firms and other jobs and stuff, and we just reunited 2 weeks ago. And so this is our first duo.
It's like the band's back together.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so
cool.
the way we like to do it and then hand it over to Liz is we like these things to be interactive as much as possible. We will throw questions out at you at times, but it's even better if you throw questions our way, because your questions are going to be more like other people's questions sitting here than ours are, or the questions Liz and I get. So have the chat take us away.
All right, so we kind of thought for a while about how to title this, because what does good enough look like? Just to preface, the privacy laws and the security laws that we'll talk about, if you're subject to them, it's not like you get to pick what parts you want to comply with. So we're definitely not advocating to kind of go through your laundry list and say, well, I like this, but I don't like this, so I'm just going to ignore it. But we also want to be practical, because companies spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on privacy and security every year, and that's just not feasible or practical for a lot of organizations and a lot of emerging growth companies. And so we kind of wanted to take a look and say, well, what are the big ticket items that can catch you out? And I really put it into three buckets. Regulators, we all talk about the fines and the kind of investigations that can happen if you get it wrong on privacy and security, and that is without a doubt a concern, but it's not the only concern. And realistically, depending on the types of information that you're working with, that might not be your biggest concern. M&A transactions, investment, funding rounds, anything that involves investor diligence or purchaser diligence, that's where often the rubber hits the road on these things for companies like I suspect a lot of you in this room have. And we've seen deals stop, slow down, price reduced, all sorts of things, because some of these things that we'll talk about haven't really been thought about. And then the third is, customers, right? If you're either a consumer-facing brand, consumers are concerned about privacy. We have lots and lots of stats about how much people care now, and it's certainly more than they used to. But also, if you're a vendor and you're providing services to other companies, those other companies are really going to care about these things. So with all of that, what we wanted to look at is, okay, what are those big ticket items that you can think about and think about how to hit those so that you're kind of hitting a good enough standard and avoiding some of that friction with those three areas. Go for it.
Yes, so some definitions to get us started with, because you notice the title is privacy, what does good enough look like? There's actually two areas of data laws that can sometimes be used, that people sometimes confuse. And as technology and data is becoming more and more used, there's this divergence between the two disciplines, data privacy and data security. Privacy is to do with your obligations as a collector of data and how you are able to use it. Can I sell it? Can I give it to someone so that they can then sell their goods and products? Are there any limits to the way I use it? Can I gather information that's for a person under a certain age or over a certain age? That's use, and that's privacy. Data security, or sometimes referred to as cybersecurity, is what are the obligations around securing the data once you have it? So there is a divergence. Sorry, mate. There is a divergence in these two areas, but there's obvious overlap as well. Liz is a real gun when it comes to data privacy, and I'm decent on the data security side. And this is why these are the two areas we're going to be talking about and taking turns on today. But the thing that's exciting about talking to a group like this is, in the background, looming large in these two areas is data innovation. And sometimes the innovative uses of data don't necessarily fit into data security or data privacy boxes, but they're finding their way into laws, regulations, and industry standards. And one example of this is, does anyone know what dark patterns are? You heard that term? I'm seeing 3 or 4 of you. What's your understanding of dark patterns?
A good example of of that when it comes to data security, I guess, or
Yeah.
I guess GDPR. You get to the websites and they pull up the little warning that says, do you consent to us stealing all your cookies and information? Okay.
Yeah.
And then you have okay, and you can click that, or you can, I guess, hit the back button and not get to whatever the content is, right?
Right.
So
Right.
you are pretty much forcing the user to go down an evil path.
Yes, and I've got a bit more of a cynical definition of it. It's manipulative use of data to get people to sign up for stuff that they otherwise would not. So for example, I've got 2 or 3 apps on my phone that I just can't be bothered getting rid of. It sounds pathetic, but I've tried. One of them's, I'm not going to say what one of them is, but it takes forever to get down to the fine print and just exit out. So there are these tricks being used to get people to pay money for services or products, and that's called a dark pattern. It doesn't necessarily fit into privacy or security, but it's a use of data or a misuse of data that is forming a new type of category. So the FTC started doing workshops on these and saying to companies, sending letters to companies saying, we've looked at your website and we think there are dark patterns on it. Better stop doing it.
And we'll talk in a minute about some of the state privacy laws, and I promise we're not going to cite sections and cases at you. But Colorado, Phil Weiser, the Colorado AG, has said that dark patterns and that those manipulative uses of data are areas that he's going to look at for enforcement when Colorado's privacy law comes into force mid next year.
Okay.
But that's a really nice segue. So.
Yeah.
Sorry, I hate to interrupt, but just I hope maybe if you did this a month from now, there'd be a third on the California one, this new youth.
Yep. 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 And if we did this, a month from now as well, that I did not do what I normally do before these presentations, which was to look and just search new US state privacy laws, because these things are coming up like monthly. We've got new laws coming into play. We go back to when I started as a lawyer, and I'm not going to say when that was, but I used to talk about, so I started off life as a lawyer in the UK, and I used to come out and talk to groups about UK privacy law and European privacy law, and I'd sit and I'd stand, I'd have these conversations, and then inevitably at the end somebody would stick their hand up and they'd say, okay, this sounds great, but what happens if we don't comply? And my answer would be, you'll get a nasty letter, and that's it. Well, fast forward more years than I like, and here we are. So we've got major legislation in Europe, the UK, China, Australia, Canada, you name it. Countries are coming up with regulations, and the US has kind of lagged behind that. Now, in defense of my adopted country, the US is not as bad as a lot of people think. We're actually way ahead for quite a long time on security breach, right? If you had a breach, then you had obligations. But privacy, we were a little bit weak. Well, now we have 5 comprehensive state privacy laws, 6 if you include California's new laws that are going to come in to protect kids' data, probably dozens if we think about at a state level, various kind of nitpicky laws. But the big 5 at the moment are California, Virginia, Colorado, Utah, and Connecticut. And all of these state privacy laws place really comprehensive obligations on companies. And I'm just going to talk for a minute about what those key obligations are, because then we can talk a little bit about where you need to think about for your businesses. There's a whole bunch of obligations that flow down and are consistent among all of these laws, but the big ticket items are transparency, right? And this is for data that you're collecting, your company, for your own purposes. But transparency, like what are you doing? What are you collecting? What are you doing with that data? Who are you sharing it with? Not necessarily naming who you're sharing it with, but what types of other companies are you sharing it with? Are you sharing it with vendors that are performing services for you? Or are you sharing it with other businesses that can then, use it for their own purposes? So are you selling that data? That's what people are concerned about. And how long are you keeping it for? Right? Why are you keeping it for the length of time that you are? Those are the consistent themes that come up in these laws. And there's one more, which is a big one, and that's consumer rights. So you have a right as a consumer under these laws to ask for a copy of your data, to ask for it to be deleted in certain cases, to opt out of the sharing of that data, or in some of these laws you might be given the right to actually opt in to certain use of it. So in particular, kids' data. So consistent themes there, and what those translate into are privacy notices. The shop window of privacy compliance, telling people and regulators, because the California AG loves to spend time surfing through websites to see, where are there privacy issues in people's privacy notices. So privacy notices and that transparency. Being ready for consumer requests. If you get a deletion request, if you get a copy, give me a copy of my data, that type of request. Flowing down obligations to your vendors, and Romain can talk a little on the security piece about that. And then having a clear idea about what data your company holds. What exactly do you have and on what systems is it? Those are the key areas that if I'm looking at privacy diligence, either to say to a client, what you got, or for diligence, I'll be flagging. Yeah.
So are you saying that if it's in your agreement, then it's okay to gather the data or not?
If it's in your agreements, it's what?
It's okay to gather the data.
If you're transparent.
I believe under the GDPR, certain data is not allowed to gather at all. So
no. So GDPR is GDPR for folks is the European privacy regulation, and the UK. I'm still in denial about Brexit, so I'll be headed to my grave, and I'll still be thinking that UK is part of Europe. No, so generally there isn't a prohibition on collecting data under GDPR. You just have to have a valid reason that needs to fit within one of a number of enumerated.
Yeah, but the reason cannot be it's in our agreement, right?
Correct.
That's not.
Correct. You have to have a legal reason, legal basis for wanting to collect that information.
In the US, it's not, right? If it's in the agreement, it's allowed.
So long as you are transparent about what you're collecting and why, and then what you do matches up with what you say, then you should be good under US law. But where people run into trouble is that they have their privacy notice, and then they kind of go off on a foray of their own around what they're doing with the data. And an example of that, and I don't want to hog the conversation, but an example of that is biometrics. Right, biometric data is a hot ticket item here, particularly in the US. and particularly if you're using facial recognition technologies without consent, or fingerprint technologies without consent.
And one of the most severe enforcement actions relating to what Liz is talking about happened in 2019 when Facebook paid $5 billion settlement to the FTC. And the allegation by the FTC was, you guys have been collecting data and pushing it off to others to use it as they see fit in violation of what you're telling people you're collecting the data from. And then also, what made it really worse was, also we've come after you for this before. And you actually signed an agreement saying you wouldn't do it again. It was back in 2011 and 2012. And you're still doing it. And so that was the $5 billion settlement. Some would argue drop in the bucket for Facebook at the time. Others would say, no, that was meaningful. Facebook was saying, we bought companies and we didn't know they were doing that. So there's a lot of confusion as to what's enforceable and when it's going to be enforced and not.
Are there any laws around what happens to the data after you've given it to a company and then they've gone out of business or sold it to someone else?
So when you, under the US laws, your obligations are when you're collecting that data. So if your company has it, if you then sell it to somebody else and that business, makes a nefarious use of it, under the current state laws, there's nothing that the state AGs can do about that other business's use. As long as when you've transferred it to that business, you've done it, kind of in accordance with the law. So, you want to make sure that in your privacy notice you say, we might provide your information to another company if we sell our assets or we sell our business. Now, the regulators would look, the regulators would look quite askance at, that other company's use of your information. And the FTC has gotten involved sometimes where companies have sold, information as part of an asset sale, say, and haven't actually, either haven't said in their privacy notice that we might do this, or have sold that asset and then it's being used for a completely different purpose. The FTC doesn't like that, and they have gotten involved in those cases.
And there's also guidance on that. There's NIST, which is a federal agency that provides guidance on how to handle data, will say there's a decommissioning or a media sanitation guide that they recommend that gets used. Some companies have been sued, mostly banks, for shutting down branches and turning them into data centers and then throwing away the computers and not making sure those computers were wiped. JP Morgan Chase got sued for something like that several years ago. So there are processes and procedures, often in contracts. There's a provision that can be added that says when you agree to inform us when you are going out of business or when you are winding down your operations, and then we agree to talk about the data you've got and how you're going to return it. So it usually can be all put forth in a contract. Can I transition us a little bit?
Yeah.
So I will, based on these 5 statutes. So this is an example of how security has gotten ahead in the US of privacy. Have any of you received a letter that starts out by saying, we regret to inform you? And it's from one of your favorite restaurants or hotels or service provider. Your information may have been compromised or was compromised, and then gives you a list of things to do that you can do about it. So that's usually consistent with or as a result of a data breach statute in a particular state that you're getting it from or where you might reside. And the first data breach statute, I think, was in 2003, and then by 2018, every state had their own data breach statute. New Mexico, Alabama, and I think one of the Dakotas were last. Contrast that now to where we're at with privacy law. You can see how much privacy is lagging based on data breach statutes. But of course, There are many other cybersecurity-based statutes, but the data breach statute is the most common. And this is where I get to go up against Liz a little bit, because Liz deals on the front end with a lot of tech companies. She's what we call a transactional lawyer. She does deals, and she makes sure data and technology can be sold, and transferred or used in specific ways, licensing agreements and things like that. And so she often sees what companies are doing before I do. I tend to see what they do when something goes bad. but I'm trying to get more on the front end. That's why I've come back to be working with Liz. And I love setting up what I do with this quote, and also with what you can take and implement it into what you guys are doing with the data you collect. This is recent. This is just this year. Charlie's new to Microsoft as their chief of security. And he says cybersecurity is the mother of all problems. If you don't solve it, all the other technology stuff just doesn't happen. So I feel pretty good about job security. but for you guys, what does it all mean? I mean, cybersecurity is defined, so every state has their own data breach statute, and they're mostly the same, but some of them define personal information differently. North Carolina has, I think, almost a dozen different definitions. Where I'm residing right now, Utah has as little as they can. I think it's driver's license, credit card, social security number, and that's about it. Other states will just expand it. California, of course, health information is included in there. But figuring out what you should do for cybersecurity has become massively complicated. We refer to the patchwork of laws that are out there. Last year, or it was the year before, in 2020, there were over 100 bills considered just relating to cybersecurity. About 30 or 40 of them passed. So what I'm going to just focus on is just what the common threads are with all of the cybersecurity laws. And there are three main things.
Can I jump in really quickly? So why these common threads are important, again, it comes back to the sort of central theme of what we're talking about here. Diligence, right? These questions come up in diligence. If you're looking for investment, if you're looking to sell your company, if you're looking to buy a company, these are the types of questions that the privacy and security lawyers are going to ask. They also come up, going back to that quote from Charlie Bell, these issues come up if you have a breach, right? The privacy regulators, and to be honest, your customers, once your customers have done the initial diligence, if you're a vendor, they're not going to come knocking on your door, right, to look at what you're doing. And the same with the regulators. They don't come and audit companies generally for things like this. But if you have a breach, then the hood gets popped. And if you have to tell California AG, or if you have to tell one of your enterprise customers, we've had a breach, you're going to get a whole load of questions. And these issues come up in those questions. So that's where these are relevant from a kind of low-hanging fruit, big ticket item issues to think about.
Yeah, and I'm just going to focus on the top three: incident response plans, risk assessments, and written information security programs, or what we in the biz called ERPs, RA, WISPs. If you remember nothing else, just remember I learned about ERPs, RAs, and WISPs today. But they're governance structures. They're not that technical. I wouldn't be involved. They're papers that say, here's what we do. We've looked at our systems. We've looked at what we collect. We've worked with our IT folks. We've worked with other stakeholders to just come up with 3 documents: incident response plan, a risk assessment, and a written information security program. Let me tell you about the first one. And it's basically, it's easy. You can Google right now, IRP, or a little more specific, incident response plan, or even more specific, cybersecurity incident response plan, and there are a ton of templates. And you're off. You choose one and then you just build it, you state its purpose, you start implementing it, you start talking to people within your company who are really close to the data, and you've fulfilled, or you're on your way to fulfilling, one of the main requirements of our cybersecurity program. An incident response plan, all the agencies ask about it. They've got templates on their websites. If you've had an incident and you get investigated or sued, one of the things they want to know is how ready were you for it? Were you scrambling in the moment? Or did you have a plan? Is it a plan that you had worked on together and teased out and tailored for the size and scope of your organization? Or is it just that template I talked about? You just pulled off Google. In fact, bit of a war story. The SEC got really active in going after investment companies that weren't protecting, in their view, investors' monies and personal information enough. And they prosecuted a company because it had borrowed from one of its subsidiaries their incident response plan and put their name on it and done nothing else. It was in their system, but it didn't replace names, it didn't replace the types of data, it was just the cover was replaced. And so it kind of highlights the importance that some regulators put on it. I've been in litigation defending local companies here in data breaches, and the request for evidence usually starts out, please give us any and all documents relating to an incident response plan, who were the team members, when it was devised, when it was updated, when it was tested, and when it was used in this particular incident. So, incident response plans are important. Risk assessments, these are some of the elements of it. They're dry documents. All of those three documents are dry. They're abstract until you actually work through them as a team and until you actually right size it and scope it for your organization. These are just some of the parts. What do you reckon?
I'm going to jump in quickly before you get to the risk assessment. So I'm going to bet that 50% of the companies represented in this room have probably signed up to an agreement that says that they have a written incident response plan in place. And these things come up in contracts, all the time. If you're dealing with an enterprise customer, if you're a vendor, and you're working off of that enterprise customer's paper for their agreement, you've probably signed up to say that you have one of these in place. Again, that enterprise customer isn't going to come and knock on the door and say, hey, show us that IRP. But if you have a breach that's on you, then that's when that enterprise customer is going to say, hey, where is that? And most of those contracts are probably going to say things like, you'll implement and maintain appropriate technical, organizational, and administrative measures to protect any data that you're processing. That's really you'll put in place reasonable security. Well, one of those measures is generally that instant response plan.
And then insurance. If you want insurance, cyber risk insurance, nowadays you'll be asked before you're given a quote as to what your premium will be. Do you have an IRP? And a lot of what we do is just helping companies be insurable so that they can even get a policy. And an IRP is a good first start or first main document to have because it's pretty easy. It can be done in 4 to 6 weeks with various meetings over Zoom, email, just collaborating amongst the group. And it's one of those documents, this is being recorded, isn't it? I'll explain what I'm about to say if I have to later. But it's one of those documents that gets you a lot more mileage than time you put into it. Like if you're able to just drop, you guys got an IRP? You see our IRP is decent. You look more sophisticated than you actually are. And legally speaking, you look good with an IRP. And it informs where you have some risks, which leads me to the next main document, a risk assessment. You've been involved in many of those recently?
Less so on the security side.
Yeah, more on the privacy side.
Mhm.
So a risk assessment is just how it sounds. It typically involves Liz or I hiring for our clients a technical consultant to come in and assess how good they look from the inside, infrastructure-wise, with the data they're collecting. So looking at their systems, their networks, based on usually mapped to a framework, and that has various controls, sometimes hundreds of controls. And then the risk assessment will generate a report that we then try to put into English, that we then sit down with boards or companies and talk about the legal risks that have been exposed through the risk assessment. And it's another one of those documents that gets asked about. And in a lot of instances, you have clients who insist you have one and that you share it with them. And that gets into some other issues, but it's a bit of, it's an inspection of what you're doing and how you do it. But they're useful and they're a good document because they, again, show that you've taken steps to make sure you understand the security obligations around the data you collect.
And again, you mentioned, clients or, enterprise customers asking for these. I think this is an important point as well. So these privacy laws, if you're on the vendor side, if you're providing services to other companies, generally the buck stops with, your customer from a regulatory perspective, right? If there's a breach, your customer's asked you to do something with the data, and you're unfortunate enough to suffer a breach. It's your customer's the one that's going to get into trouble first off with the regulators, and your customer's probably the one that's going to get hit with the lawsuit under, say, California law from individuals who've been impacted. But your customer's going to look to you for that. They're going to look down, as I said before, you've probably signed up to protections in agreements for your customers already. And so your customers are going to want to know, okay, well, have you met those requirements? Have you met those measures? And more we're seeing, particularly for customers who are outsourcing, processing of data that's sensitive information, like financial information or, health information, not necessarily health information that's covered by HIPAA or those federal laws, but, wearable technologies, anything like that. Those customers are asking for risk assessments. They're sending out these pages and pages of, do you have an incident response plan? Tell us about your encryption. Tell us about your firewalls, those types of things. And so, again, the more kind of ready for answers you are for those, then the better. And again, I've seen deals with customers fall apart because the client that we've been representing has looked at those and kind of tried to brush them off. I had one where their sales folks answered the questionnaire, and you can imagine, no disrespect to folks in sales, but that didn't go well with the large insurance company that they were trying to get business from. So these things they come in real life as well, and depending on the type of data that you're working with, will depend on how in depth they are. Yeah.
So how of the laws that you mentioned that were coming down the pipe in 2023, like how many of those are actual substantial, like informed policy that's hopefully been derived from people like you in the industry, and how much of it is political theater? And then the second question is, how are you seeing a lot of companies seem to bypass the privacy collection issues through anonymization of data, but subsequently you can very easily pinpoint people through triangulation through different pieces of data. Is there anything in these policies that's going to address that second level of somehow identifying individuals and their data?
I'll take the first one.
Go for it.
Second.
Yeah.
So on the first one, it's not as much political theater anymore. And the main reason for that, and I'm going to quote Chris Krebs, who is the former director of CISA, which is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. He said, we're getting our lunch eaten by Russia, North Korea, Iran, and China. And so now it's a national security issue. Yes, it's good for business to have a cybersecurity program, because it lessens reputational harm, it lessens litigation, and it improves business continuity. But it's happening so easily and readily. We're getting our butts kicked. Now it's we've got to do this, or it's substantially going to impact our economy and livelihoods. And we see this. There's a quote from one of Putin's right-hand men, I'll call him, a military person, at a conference he attended last year in December, where he declared being in a third world war with the rest of the world, and that they are winning it through cyber attacks. And so we just don't think like that. You know, we're not at war, or we're not part of cyber attacks to exist and survive. That's where some of these nation-state actors go from a mental standpoint. And so there are substantive policies, or rather laws and regulations coming down that are very well thought out and that are rigorous. The New York Department of Financial Services is one of the more active state regulators, and they have detailed plans that they expect covered entities to comply with. Healthcare has been rigorous for quite a while, so has the financial institution. You have a question back there?
Yes. For the IRPs, how are they going to apply it to things like the F5 systems, where you had just a firmware issue with just random root access?
You'll have to explain that exploit to me a little bit. Did it exfiltrate data, or were
Administrative access to the management. There was a root access vulnerability. I forget the classification, but it was 0 day, and it was
Okay.
being exploited at large companies like Netflix, Facebook.
Yeah.
Lots of data open, but I was wondering, as far as your IRP,
Yeah.
does that,
Okay.
does that,
Now I get
do you
you.
really need to cover that, or do you need to cover
Yeah.
that? Because it would kind of be the manufacturer's fault a little bit because of the firmware.
Yeah, but the IRP would help you get to the point where you know
Where
it was
the
someone
line
else's
is.
fault.
Okay.
And that it documents processes and procedures that enable you to not just sit back and hope or blame someone else vaguely,
Right.
but you get to say, according to our IRP, we deployed our IRT, which is the incident response team. That team was governed by the IRC, the incident response coordinator, and we went to Appendix F in our IRP because we anticipated that this might happen. So the IRP I've talked about quite loosely,
And the insurance
but
companies
it's
already seen that.
what's that?
The insurance companies already approved the IRP, so that they're
Yes.
forced to
Yes.
provide them. Okay.
Yeah, and it's a living document,
Right.
and it should be always updated, and that's where, so for example, ransomware 3 years ago is a lot different today than it was then. If any of you had the awful experience of going through a ransomware, either through getting the letter or anything like that, I've participated in about 12 to 15. Took home a lot of money, I'll tell you. No, just kidding. I mean, defending companies in about 12 to 15 different instances, and it's dramatically changed. Whereas 3 years ago, I might have tried to negotiate. I can't do that anymore. It's too complex. And so there are companies, just so you understand the gravity, there is a company called Coveware, and all they do is negotiate ransoms. And they negotiate about 150 a month. So my contact there does 3 or 4 a week at about $10,000 a pop. And they're really good. Like most of the times, they will get data back and a payment will be made. They're so good, they even make payments straight out of their own Bitcoin accounts and get reimbursed by the insurers. I shouldn't say they're so good, it's so prevalent. But
Just more random, so sorry to deter.
No, it's good.
On point a little bit. With those payments, are they the negotiations to get a lower cost per data? And are they paid as the data is released? Is that a strategy?
yes, so what was the first part? Is that
Negotiating the lower payment per data used.
yeah, so it's every ransomware I've been involved with, the price came down dramatically. And so with a company like Coveware, they'll have a database. They will know who they're dealing with, and they will know the trades.
So is that the states you just mentioned, or is it criminals?
Yeah.
Yes.
In my mind, yeah. Did you say nation state actors or
Yeah.
criminals? In my mind, they're just criminals. Yeah, but there's a tie back to some nation somehow.
Well,
We don't go that deep. Am I understanding your question right, sir?
yeah, but interesting fact there. So as you mentioned, a lot of these ransomware attacks do come out of Russia. Since the war in Ukraine, so we have a very large incident response practice. We probably deal with 5 or 6 incidents a day. Not necessarily Romain and myself, but another group in our team. And our incident response work has gone down a little bit since the war in Ukraine. And we and the insurers and the ransomware negotiators are attributing that to other events that are kind of keeping people occupied in some of those nation states.
But back to your series of questions, in the IRP there's a section dedicated to incident classification. And you can have various ways that because you don't want to shoot everything up to the board and saying, I just got phished and I don't know how bad this is, but it happened. So there's an incident classification part of an IRP that's quite technical. And again, from the legal standpoint, seeing that it exists, seeing that it's detailed, seeing that it's added to over time through appendices and things, when new exploits like that come up, is a huge plus. And the risk assessment part of your governance can inform your IRP, right? You see the connection. You might do an assessment and think, oh boy, we collect a lot more personal information than we realize. You may have these stashes of data, say the sales team is hogging stuff you didn't know they retained.
Or to the point that you made, we think that we have all this data that we think is anonymous, and actually it isn't, right? That's something that quite often comes up either through data mapping or these risk assessments. One part of the company has said, yeah, don't worry about it, we anonymize all of this. And when you actually look, it's like, well, no, you don't. You stick an identifier on it, to cover up the name, and that's it. That's not that. To your point, is not anonymous data. And I want to make sure I don't forget your question, which was about anonymous data. So these privacy laws and the breach notification laws, they only apply to identifiable data, right? If you can't identify an individual from that, from those data attributes, then the state comprehensive laws don't apply to that data. And so everybody, kind of goes, oh, that's great. We don't need to worry about it because we only collect IP address or, something like that. Well, IP address, device ID, all, if you can link it to somebody, it's identifiable. And the problem with anonymization, and actually there was a law professor at CU, Professor Paul did some research in this area to say 9 times out of 10 when you say that data is anonymous, it is not. It is possible through, to your point, triangulation, blending that data with other sources, other data, people who are way cleverer than me in math, being able to kind of work through that data, you can generally identify somebody from that information. And there's a train of thought, without getting too philosophical, that it is never really possible to de-identify data. So you have to be very careful if you're listening to people within your organization say, well, don't worry, we don't have to worry about these laws, it's not identifiable. You really want to be questioning that to make sure that is actually correct. Yeah.
Are there any rules of thumb around that anonymization and de-anonymization? Like, if you collect 10 pieces of information, statistically speaking, you can identify anyone on the planet, but if you only collect 3, then it's a lot harder, something like that.
So there is research out there that I think the technical term for it goes to small numbers.
Yeah.
And the example that comes up a lot is if you're talking about I use my dad as an example, actually. So my dad is an above the knee amputee. In theory, you could say, okay, well, there's one above the knee amputee in this particular area in the north of England. Well, from that you can probably figure out through a process of deduction, that that's Don Harding, my dad. And he doesn't mind me using this example. I've told him before I use it. But and you can say, well, okay, we'll limit it to a certain zip code, right? Well, you can still, the demographics in a certain area might be sufficiently thin that it's not that difficult to figure it out. So again, there are people who are way, way smarter than me and statisticians who can explain it better, but yeah.
I want to question. So it sounds like you help people with the side of the law that is enforcing the law, but there's also the side of people make laws that not necessarily it can't be enforced, but that it's really hard from a technical perspective in order to do the thing that they're asking you to do, which is part of the new law in California. It's really hard to identify who is under the age of 13 that randomly went to your website. And so how do you, is there some sort of strategy in helping those companies to say, hey, there's this new law, but we can't do it.
Yeah.
I think it's technically very, 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 very hard to do.
Yeah. That's a really good question. So, and I think, again, this is where that kind of good enough piece comes in. So, even with, we've had federal laws that relate to kids' data for a long time, COPPA. But even there, it's like, well, how do you know if it's a kid? How do you know if it's an adult? And, these laws will require you to obtain consent from a parent to be able to use kids' data. But again, my kids are smart. They could fake an email from me anytime. So how far do you have to go? And it really, just at a high level, comes to, if you have a website that is directed at kids, you have a much, much higher, bar to meet than if you have a, like a law firm website, right? I don't know, maybe kids come to the Pulse-Nilly website if they can't sleep. But, so I think it really depends on what your website is doing. And if you meet that high threshold, then, you have to put a lot of thought into your content. And it's not just, it's the technical, how do you figure out that you're getting parental consent, but also it's your privacy notice. There was a company in Europe got fined because their website was directed at kids, but they had a normal, long, lengthy, not very easy to read privacy notice, and they didn't translate it into local language. And the regulators said, no, your site is directed at kids, and there are special regulations there.
If I might just follow on to this,
Yeah.
because your answer makes lots of sense, but as I read the California law, it's kids under 18.
Right.
And your answer makes sense in the terms of a regulator is not going to go after you because Pulse-Nilly didn't put up the right notice. But as I understand the law, a parent can sue on behalf of their kids. So you have this sort of non-linear thinking about the threat.
Yeah.
And so is Pulse-Nilly going to need to put a thing up that says, I agree I'm over 18, and what happens with that thing?
Yeah, so generally, we will have a notice, but I need to check this when we get back. But we'll have something that says, this site is not directed at people under the age of 18. Those types of statements. So you're making it clear as much as you can that your site is not, you're not attracting an audience of kids. Now there's areas where this becomes difficult, right? What about, if you've got a film review website or NFTs? We had this conversation the other day that actually, consumers of NFTs are, a lot of the time, they're kids, they're young people. And so I think the starting point for this, and I'm just conscious of time a little bit, but the starting point for these discussions is really thinking through, yes, there's some obvious, site. If you've got a My Little Pony fan club site, then sure, you need to be worried about this. But other questions about your site as well. Is it still directed to kind of under 18s, but in a less obvious way? And then, kind of really digging deep on that.
If it's okay, I'd love to hear a litigation perspective on that too.
Yeah.
Like how much threat is there from the parents suing?
Oh, well, I'm not aware, is there a private
Yeah.
right of action?
Yeah, under the new California law. And
Okay.
so I can jump in on that really
Yeah.
quickly, just based on what we're seeing with other laws that have these private right of actions. It's brutal. So Illinois has a biometric privacy law that provides a private right of action. California has private right of action for certain data breaches. And to put it into context, 2 years ago, we did not have a privacy litigation team at our firm. We now have a significant privacy litigation team, and it's growing because and some of the claims that come in have merit, but the ambulance chaser plaintiffs.
So I'm now relevant to Liz again,
But no, I mean.
after 5 years.
Those claims, it used to be the old toxic tort, or you kind of. I felt trip and fall claims. Well, those same, law firms are now pursuing claims under these privacy laws.
And there's typically with these, there's a cure period. I know there was under CCPA, and I don't know if that's gone away, Liz. But there's a period where the parent or the person who is saying, hey, our rights as a consumer were violated, must give notice to the company, and then they can have a little bit of time to cure that. But with this new one, I don't know if that exists.
Yeah, and the issue is it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter if you can cure. It doesn't, it does, but it does. You still have to deal with it, and that's the thing. Like I got a client that just got hit with a claim under some obscure California wiretap law for using a chat box. Well, they're going to be able to push back on that. They're going to be able to make that go away, but not without spending significant amounts of cash unfortunately, on legal counsel.
On me. And here's what I do in that type of litigation is I say to the judge, this may have happened, we're not going to admit that it did, but there's no harm. There's no harm. And then the plaintiff, the parent or the consumer comes back and says, yes, judge, I've been harmed because my information was stolen and someone out there is going to use it. And then I say to the judge, and judge, when they do use it, then they can come back into court and tell you about it. But right now they haven't used it, and they don't have a case or controversy or under the Constitution legal standing to ask you, judge, to give an advisory opinion about something that might happen down the road. So that's the main defense in these types of cases is what's the harm? But there's case law that's saying, well, then I have to go change my credit card info and my gym membership and my lease, and I have to, that's time out of that I'm having to spend to change. And some courts are saying, yeah, you know what, the hassle is enough, I'm going to let this case go forward, and that's probably the trend.
But even if they don't, you still have to get to that.
You still pay me.
And
Small.
the harm on this one is weird because it's like, well, my kid read that thing on the Listen Up site, and
Right.
and now he's gonna want to grow up and not be a lawyer, and so
Probably not a harm.
So where's the harm?
No, but
That's the
you're right,
benefit.
and again, how much teeth these claims will have remains to be seen. But I joke that we as privacy lawyers, we could clean up if we went and set up a plaintiff side claims house, because they don't these claims they're not very good, but you still have to deal with them. And so the more, again, like just bringing this back to the kind of the theme, the more you can do up front to prevent that happening and protect yourselves, it's great because hopefully you don't get you don't get the nasty gram from the lawyers, but also you don't get the awkward questions as you're talking to your customer, talking to your investor, talking to your potential buyer. Yes, and I'm conscious of time. I think we're all right for a few more minutes.
We're absolutely not letting you continue your presentation.
No, these are the best types. I would do this any day over, honestly, droning on through a bunch of slides that people are falling asleep. So yeah, go for it.
I'm wondering, because you said the amount of cases that you have are growing, a lot of the clients that I've had in the past, I don't know, however long, when when I talk about this, they're, well, we're too small. Or in your instance, all we're doing is running a forum site for My Little Ponies and having, you know what, GA and some ads on the side. We're not doing anything that, you know, is gonna speak of being, you know, needing policies and everything around it, other than, you know, throwing up a privacy policy and a, you know, terms of use page and have that be that. How much are you seeing your cases now being things like the My Little Pony forum site, you know, ones of that level?
Well, the one that came, without giving anything away, the one that came in yesterday was a fairly small direct-to-consumer kitchenware company. You know, the plaintiffs bar, in fact, they quite like those smaller companies because they don't have the resources to fight them, and so they'll settle. And that's what they want. They don't necessarily want, and you correct me if I'm wrong here, but they don't always want the massive class actions. What they like is the $10,000 hit to make it go away.
Yeah, that's not bad. 10, 20 grand for a demand letter and a complaint that they've just ginned from their template. So.
When it comes to like companies that are hosted on other websites, or like other companies like Squarespace or GoDaddy or something, who would be held responsible for that data? Because like, yeah, the small business would be, I can see that, but would the hosting provider also be held responsible because they're storing data for the small business?
Well, that small business will have signed a contract for the web host that basically says we limit any liability in the event, unlikely as it might be, there is an incident where some of the data we're processing for you is exposed. And so in the contractually, they will limit their liability, and in a lot of states that's enforceable to a point. You can't contract around gross negligence, or you can't contract around not having security when you knew and actually had multiple instances of a breach. That would be deemed gross negligence. It's as if you knew it was going to happen. And so there are contractual limitations for the host that will push, you know, liability away from them, but they can't free themselves entirely. And so the thing to do for the small business in that type of situation is due diligence about what the service provider's able to do or what they're doing with the data, and then what their reputation is. Do they have an IRP? Have they done a risk assessment? And do they have a written information security program?
I just wanted to help along with the presentation.
Thank you.
Got you.
Thank you for the softball. Do they have a
Maybe
written
the gift card
information-
later.
Questions?
Do the anti-SLAPP statutes help at all with those nuisance suits, or are those privacy laws exempted from those?
We're not seeing them help.
No.
No, not really.
It's not a magic button that can go away.
No. Those statutes are, the statutory claims are, the problem with them is that the way they're written, you don't need to show much merit. If you can point to the fact that there was a violation of the law, then that's generally enough to get you over that at least first hurdle. Might not be enough to get you all the way, but by that point you still have to deal with it.
So to recap, or at least to finish, for low-hanging fruit governance structures that will serve you really well, and that's on the security side, incident response plan, a risk assessment, and a WISP, or written information security program. And the state I live in, Utah, being the progressive state it is, implemented a new statute last year, which really is progressive. It's called the Cybersecurity Affirmative Defense Act. And it's basically a safe harbor. And what that means is they've got a statute that says if you have a WISP, or if you have a written information security program, and you have a breach, and someone sues you for it, you get to point to the statute, so long as you comply with it, by having a WISP that has some of the criteria that's set forth in the statute. So it's another example of legislatures saying, hey, this is so bad, we gotta help out businesses somehow. And Utah and several other states have enacted this statute. It just codifies what's generally the rule anyway. If you have a WISP, if you've done a risk assessment, you have an IRP, you've got defenses. In fact, I would go so far as to say if you have those three things and they're pretty polished and current, you're 90% liability free because they're that important as far as governance.
And you're walking the walk.
And you're walking the walk. You're looking good to your business partners.
So if you're just starting out, is a template that you just kind of like put some names in there? Is that okay? Is that good enough? Or because there's no, like, if it's 2 counties, you don't have like.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, do you have a third-party service provider that does your IT or anything like that?
It's just.
So I have. So the short answer is yes. I have small, medium, and large WISP templates.
Sure.
And it's just so a company can have a first look at it and work on it themselves and then come back to me or work with a technical consultant to flesh it out. But the laws, this is probably more to your question, the law says, say in this instance, as long as you have a WISP that's suitable for the size and scope of the business you have and the data you collect. So you don't need to go nuts when you're the small company and you hardly collect any data, or data is just a small part of your business model.
Would you recommend like limiting the amount of data that you're collecting? Like,
Always.
Yes.
Always.
So a common theme, backtracking right to the very beginning, one of the other common themes that isn't up there is data minimization. Less is absolutely better. For so many reasons. It's a regulatory requirement under a lot of these laws to, keep it minimal. But obviously, the less you have, if you have a breach, the less there is to have to worry about.
It's also refreshing. The companies are so extractive, startups and so forth. But there is definitely a model. Any Web3 startups or companies here in the blockchain crypto space. Web3 is that new supposed iteration of the internet that is decentralized, whereby there won't be data centers, but there will be our phones, our computers, other things, other nodes will be those things that verify that run the internet. And so data minimization and having less is becoming a bigger thing in that world and in that space, because it's just those companies aren't going to be as extractive or in need of so much data. In fact, they want less because they know who you are. You're anonymous, but it's a whole nother world. Don't get me started. But anyone got NFTs? No, okay, it's coming. You're all going to have them soon, maybe. Right. Any other questions? Glossed over some things. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm like debating the question because I feel like we're just taking up a lot of time on where would SOC 2 fall in all of this?
Yeah, so SOC 2, for those who haven't heard of that process, there are various ways or attestations or audit reports or standardized ways of testing security. And in some industries, certain types are done. SOC 1 is a type of attestation. SOC 2 is high level, it's detailed, and there are hundreds of controls. It's arduous. There's SOC 2 type 1 and type 2. Type 1 usually is to prepare you for type 2, which may be required in certain industries, especially financial industries. They're wanting you to verify through an audit report that's rigorous, that you meet a certain standard, or that you are beholden to results that were gleaned from this attestation. You're beholden to making improvements. You have a set forth plan. So a SOC 2, say in Utah under that statute, would easily be something that helps comply or enable you to have a safe harbor.
Would it replace any of the 3 that we talked about?
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's a good question. And look, all the three things that I talked about would be part of the analysis that goes into that. In excruciating detail,
Got it.
they would be analyzed. And if you have them already, you're getting quick ticks. You know, they're quickly becoming, they will shorten the audit period. SOC 2 can be 8, 9 months, 10 months. They can go on and be disruptive because you're pulling people away from what they do to participate and be interviewed and so forth.
Yeah, the
Thank you.
places where I've been that have gone through that, it's usually been a year-long process.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and then you got to renew it.
yeah.
Or you've identified things that the client will want fixed with you as you being the service provider. Yeah. It's been lovely to be with you. Thank you for the questions.
Yeah, thank you.
Feel free to reach out. Polsinelli, which and there's lots of law firms that go by the name Polsinelli. Just Polsinelli is a pretty distinctive law firm name. It's not Delhi. It's Polsinelli. It's a firm of about 1,000 lawyers and 23 offices. And I opened up the new offices like on the heels of what Liz has done here. So we're all about this ecosystem is friendly.
Yeah.
You know, and that's been a gratifying thing for us. So if you have questions, just fire them our way. We might not be able to respond right away, but we can send you, you know, in a direction you need to go. We're happy to.
Cool. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.